This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am Kevin Randle, and I will be joined in just a moment by Nick Redfern. But before I bring Nick onto the program, I just wanted to say one thing, or maybe several things, who knows. Back on June 25th, we had that ridiculous UAP report given to the Congress that I think of as a C- high school project. Won't go into the details of that. We all know that. At that time, they said 90 days, there would be an update. The 90 days is expired, and I can find no evidence of an update. I'm thinking what happened is the Director of National Intelligence was caught flat-footed when, in early June, people began talking about the report that would be issued. And they hadn't really done anything, so they scrambled to put something together, and then they bought some more time by saying in 90 days we'll have an update. Nobody's talking about that. So I think that they're just kind of letting it fall by the wayside. But I have more about that at my blog, and you can take a look at that, some of the things that are going on in that respect. So I just thought I'd bring that up because if there's something going on out there and I'm not aware of it, I'm sure somebody will let me know through email that I've messed up on that. As I say, I'm going to be talking to Nick Redfern, who is a full-time author, journalist, specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracy, alien abductions, and the paranormal phenomenon. He writes regularly for the London Daily Express newspaper, Fortean Times, Fate, and UFO Magazine. Well, probably not UFO Magazine anymore. His previous books include Three Men Seeking Monsters, Strange Secrets, Cosmic Crashes, and the FBI Files. And his latest book is called Cleverly Time Travel, and we'll be talking about that, which is why he's here today. Among his many exploits, Nick has investigated reports of lake monsters in Scotland, vampires in Puerto Rico, werewolves in England, aliens in Mexico, and sea serpents in the United States. I think we should get the aliens in the United States because they're crossing the border in great numbers. Oh, wait, I'm not supposed to say that. Nick Redfern has traveled and lectures extensively around the world. Originally from England, he currently lives in Arlington, Texas, home of the Dallas Cowboys. I just had to throw that Dallas Cowboys thing in because they're doing fairly well this year. Nick Redfern, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Hey, Kevin. How's it going?
How far are you from the Cowboy Stadium?
How far? 20 minutes, maybe. Yeah.
You ever go to the games?
No.
Wow. Well, they're on TV, so who cares?
What's that?
I say they're on TV, so who cares?
That's right.
I'm holding in my hand a copy of your latest book called Time Travel, the Science and Science Fiction. Time Travel, the Science and Science Fiction. Don't know why I stumbled over that. I thought there was something else on. I've been through it, have some questions about parts of it. What inspired this particular book?
Well, I think to some degree at least, everybody has some interest in time travel. By that, I don't mean, they sort of voraciously buy into every book that comes out or magazine. But I think, just the concept or the idea of, if only I could have gone back, or if only I could have done this, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of people at times do think that, the idea of, but knowing that, you just cannot go back. But then wondering, well, what if we actually can go back? So that was more for the sort of reason. But also, over the years, I've read some good stuff on time travel and some bad stuff on time travel. So I thought, I can't say that I would say 100% expert, but from my own perspective, I felt that, why not put out something that would be kind of along the lines of how I take time travel, wonder about it, is it real? Let's have a look into it. What's the science about it? And basically, get so the reader can have every man's aspect to time travel, if you like, because nobody, no disrespect, but nobody really wants to have something, some sort of gigantic, sort of bland and kind of book that's just going to be, what did he say? What does that word mean? So I felt, it's a complicated subject. So let's kind of, break it down a bit more for us all.
I've done a number of science fiction novels, and I've been castigated for writing science fiction. How dare you be a UFO researcher and write science fiction? But I've written a number of novels about time travel. One of them was called On the Second Tuesday of Next Week, which cleverly is available at Amazon as an ebook. And it works on the theory that the two enemies, had a big battle out near Pluto's orbit, and the Earth forces won, and the next thing you know, the Earth forces have lost because the bad guys were able to time travel and go back and fix the mistakes they made. So they end up fighting a war in time. And how do you end a war in time if you can keep going back and changing everything? And I mean, you're sort of caught in this perpetual loop of constant conflict. So I did actually resolve the problem, and I'm not going to tell anybody because now I hope I've piqued their interest and they'll go take a look at the book. But I also did a series of books on time travel, which was called The Time Mercenaries, and it started out in a dream, which I think is kind of interesting. I dreamt that we had sent mercenaries back to the Battle of the Alamo so that the Texans could win. And I dreamed I was talking to my editor about it. And he said, well, okay, but only if the Mexicans have time travelers too. And so Bob Cornett and Bob Cornett's been on this program, and I've worked quite a bit with Bob Cornett back in the 80s and early 90s, came up with a book called Remember the Alamo, which talks about how they tried to fix the Battle of the Alamo so that the Texans or the Texicans could win. And by doing that, they screwed up the timeline, and they kept having to go back to other areas to try to fix it. They ended up in Gettysburg trying to fix that because of the things they had done in 1836. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a subject that has fascinated me as well, and I've tried to work out all the various permutations in time travel. And so the great paradox supposedly is, how can you go back into the past and say, kill your grandfather? Because if you did that, you wouldn't exist and you couldn't go back in time. How do you resolve that paradox, or can you?
Well, that's a good point. And I think, that the sort of the grandfather scenario is, one of the issues more than any other, I guess, that demonstrates that time travel isn't feasible. But then on the other side of the coin, you've got the idea or the scenario of, well, if you did go back and, you came back in time and, killed this person, killed that person, well, possibly, it would create a different timeline. That's one of the angles of this as well. It's just, what if, you go back and you change this and you change that? Or is it possible that we're continually changing timelines? But then on the other hand, I have to admit, I think that one is the most persuasive one, the grandfather scenario, to make a case against time travel.
I actually figured out an answer to it. And that is That is because you are the instrument of the change, you have to exist. So even though you've gone back in time and killed your grandfather, you still exist because you had to go back in time to do it. You may have wiped out the rest of your family and all those sorts of things, but you still exist in that time scenario. But that moves us into the science fiction realm, and I just wanted to touch on that because I know your book really isn't science fiction-y. It's got a lot of other aspects to it. And I guess the quickest thing to do is look at the Thunderbird, because you talk about the Thunderbirds. Tell us about the Thunderbirds.
Well, yeah, this is a really weird story, the story of the Thunderbird photograph. And this goes back roughly a century ago, when reportedly a photograph was taken of a gigantic bird. And the story itself is a fascinating one because it's such an old story. We think of time travel, we think of sort of more sort of latter-day activity. But in relation to this story, we've got this old photograph of what supposedly looked eerily like a giant pterodactyl pinned or nailed to a barn door. And numerous people claim to have seen this photograph over the years in various magazines, supposedly like Fate and various sort of men's adventures type magazines in the 50s and 60s. And yet now, today, no one can find this photograph all over the place, despite the fact that a lot of people like John Keel and I think Lauren Coleman as well and various other researchers look into this, searched all over the place. Not a single person has been able to find the photo. So one of the theories that's been put forward is that there's been some kind of ripple in time which has quite literally erased that part of history, if you like. And there are a lot of cases like that. It kind of ties in, with the Mandela situation, where people are sure they saw this, or they were sure they saw that, or they were sure they heard this, or they heard some famous actor died, and then you find out none of this happened. And then that makes you think, well, hang on a minute, what's happened to time? What has happened to the Thunderbird photograph? Is it possible that somehow, whether directly or indirectly, would it be possible to erase a part of history? And if so, could something like the photograph be a perfect example of that?
Well, I think we should point out the Thunderbird, when we're talking about, is a gigantic bird with a wingspan with 10, 15 feet or more. And it was shot down by a couple of cowboys, I think in Arizona at the time, that did it. And then they took the photograph of that. My thought on that was, and there's a couple of directions to go on this. I think we could resolve part of this. Is one, it wasn't a photograph, it was an illustration they saw. So if you're looking for a photograph, you may not find it because it was an illustration, some kind of a drawing in an old-fashioned newspaper or something like that, as opposed to an actual photograph. And the second thought I had was, if we talk to the people, and I know we can't talk to John Keel, for example, but if we talk to the people who claim to have seen the photograph, and could you sketch what it looked like, and we could compare those notes and see if there was some common photograph or illustration they had seen, and that would at least move us one step closer to understanding what was going on.
Well, yeah, you're right, and I think when you look at these stories, I mean, in the way I look at it is that the easiest explanation when it comes to time travel is probably the easiest explanation. And so I think there's very often, a tendency to get overexcited with things like the Thunderbird photo. We can't find it. What's happened and all this. There may just actually be, a down-to-earth explanation. And
well, let me interrupt you there, because I'm running up against my brakes. And we'll carry on with the conversation when we come back. But I wanted to say that your book, of course, is called Time Travel, the Science and Science Fiction, and I have information about things we've talked about today on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And if you get a chance, take a look at the Best of Project Blue book, which is a book that came out just a few months ago, and I think you'll find some interesting things in it about Project Blue book. We will be back right after this with Nick Redfern, so please stick around. I am here with Nick Redfern, which is to say we're not in the same place because we are practicing social distancing to keep the people happy with us, I suppose. The government people from arresting us for mixing and matching. We were talking time travel. We were talking about the Thunderbirds, and I had suggested just before the break that an interesting experiment would be to get the people together who'd claimed to have seen the photograph and see if their illustrations matched with what everybody else said, because I seem to remember seeing it, but I think it was an illustration. And it was on the side of a building with a staircase on the outside, like you see in a lot of the old Western towns and that sort of thing. But what I'm thinking of is an illustration as opposed to a picture. Did you find any of those illustrations, by the way, when you were looking, Nick?
Well, what I found, I think, is probably what most people have found, and that is sort of the latter-day mock-ups of the original one. You can find a lot of photographs on the internet where, people have sort of, changed the colors to make them look dark, like brown or yellow, to make the pictures look old pictures, but they're not. So that gets things even more problematic because, people are looking for the original, and yet on the net there are more than sort of 10, 15 pictures made to look like old, sort of creased and, torn versions of the original. And that the important thing to know is that they're actually done really well. So that kind of affects our ability, really, to figure out the real story. But I think for me, although I wasn't around at the time, I think for me, when the story started to break, why isn't it in this magazine? Why isn't it there? And we all remember it. I think it was the key issue, when it all kicked off. I mean, now I don't think we're actually getting any new material, but when it started, I think that was the most important aspect, when everybody was trying to find the magazine and looking for it and coming up with good ideas.
Well, I've got a number of the pictures here, and I'll put a link on my blog so people can take a look at them. I mean, one of them is clearly an illustration, and a couple of them are very interesting. It looked like they're really taken in the proper time frame, so we'll have to take a look at all of that as well. But moving on from the Thunderbird, did you find any examples of what would be considered time travel, forward, backwards, that kind of caught your attention, caught your interest, in suggesting that maybe there was something to this idea?
Well, I mean, in the book, I cover a lot of different ground because I don't think time travel is just sort of one thing, so to speak. I think, the idea of like Back to the Future, you get in your machine and you press a date and then you zoom into, 1941 or 1856 or whatever, and then bleep back again. I don't think, for the most part, it's like that. What I found is that a lot of, from my perspective at least, a lot of time travel, I think, is achieved under very random and strange situations. I mean, one of the things I talk about now, what I'm going to say now, a lot of people may disagree with me, but I think there's a possibility that something like deja vu might be a form of time travel. It's nothing to do with DeLoreans, or anything like that. But now some people will say, well, that's just your brain, having a glitch or whatever. But it might not be, and it makes me think and wonder, what if that the world, if you like, science, however you want to look at it, I think there's a possibility that things like deja vu and things along the lines of, when people have prophetic dreams and then something comes true, 6 weeks later or something like that. That's nothing to do with achieving time travel by going through your time machine or anything like that. But it has, for me at least, a scenario that time travel isn't what we seems to be. It's not linear. It's not something we can just jump in the machine. I think most of it, the genuine stuff, forget the hoaxers and the mistakes and all that kind of stuff, I think we're dealing with something that is deeply random, I think.
But aren't you kind of talking about precognition as opposed to actually traveling in time? You're looking into the future, maybe. Of course, that kind of negates the idea of looking. You can't look back into the past because that's already there and we can access it other ways. But I mean, sort of a precognition type of scenario.
Yeah, and I'll give you another example. I've got one full chapter in the book about how in 2017, I don't know if you know this or not, but in 2017, numerous people all across the United States started to have really graphic, terrifying dreams of a nuclear war looming. And I collected all of these various cases, and the more that I got, more and more people came forward, and it was really creepy, and it really, so many people had got very, very similar nightmares, the same cities being vaporized, billions of people killed, but clearly nothing happened. However, these dreams were so graphic and similar that made me think again, things like timelines, was the reason why everybody, well, not everybody, but I mean all these people were having this dream. Is it possible that at some point that was going to happen, and at some point either it was diverted and time was changed, or it happened at random? But there were so many of those stories in 2017 of people coming forward with these eerily similar dreams and nightmares.
Well, the question that springs to mind immediately is, did they give any time frame of when this nuclear war was supposed to have happened?
2017. Yeah, that's the point.
It happened in 2017. Yeah. Oh, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, then thank God it didn't happen.
That's right. It didn't. Or as I talk about in the book, maybe it didn't happen in our time frame, but possibly, or is it possible that we can sort of have a glimpse now and again of another timeline, and vice versa, that people perhaps get to see a glimpse of our timeline? And maybe, as I also talk about this in the book, how about the case that this might tie in, with the idea when you're dealing, you've been on a plane, or you're just going down the street and you see someone looks just like you, oh my God, that's me, and then they're gone, that kind of situation that, that we've all heard of, where you've got someone who is your sort of mirror image, doppelganger. And I wonder sometimes if the doppelganger phenomenon may actually be you having a glimpse of either something in the past or the future, and then you're gone. Something along those lines.
But you're not really talking about time travel in that respect. You're talking about alternate universes, and that we have an opportunity.
Well, you could be talking about timelines as well. If, say, for example, you're going down the street and suddenly you see you coming towards you, but and then they're gone. It doesn't necessarily mean it's anything out the ordinary. But on the other hand, it could be, that if you're in a different timeline, just briefly, and your sort of double, if you like, is in another, then it doesn't necessarily mean there are two people, but it could be, one person actually being, in two places, if you like.
But that still sort of suggests to me alternate universes as opposed to alternate timelines. That there's an infinite number of universes and an infinite number of possibilities in that infinite number of universes, and therefore we catch a glimpse into that one of the timelines at some point.
No, yeah, you're right. And I think, when you're talking about sort of multiple, universes and things like that, I mean, I do think it's relative to time travel because, if you alter timelines, then basically, in some respects, you are changing time. And if you're changing time, in essence, you are time traveling,
Well, that's a good point. I wanted to ask, have you talked to any of the people who claim to have traveled through time? I mean, there's a number of people who make those claims that they're from the future and they know what's going to happen. I'm wondering where the guy was to tell me about Bitcoin, for example. But have you talked to any of these people who claim to have come from the future and can tell us what's going to happen?
Well, again, I mean, the people I've spoken to, I spoke to about 12 or 13 people I hope for the book, but 5 or 6 people ended up being interviewed. They didn't want, to be sort of perceived as crazy or whatever, which I could understand. But what I will tell you is that all the people I interviewed said things along the lines of that it was as if things just went really strange. There's the famous Versailles story, in France, 2 women going down Versailles in France, and everything suddenly changed, and then after a while everything went back to normal. And of all the people, this is what's interesting. Of all the people I interviewed, nobody was like a crazy professor with his time machine. None of them were actively looking for time travel or anything like that. But all of them were in situations where the atmosphere kind of changed, everything went sort of quiet, and then suddenly the streets looked different, the cars looked old, things like that. And again, what I found time and time again is like a random aspect to time travel, and not some guy in a white sort of a scientific coat or whatever, It was literally every case was what's going on. Oh my God, the streets changed, everything's changed. And then 5 minutes later, everything's back to normal. And the traditional time travel that everybody thinks about, you've got this machine and you can go here and you can go there and see what's going to happen next week, or, and get the lottery numbers or whatever. I've not come up, although that's the popular scenario that's talked about, and it should be talked about. But in terms of achieving time travel, most of what I've seen has been sort of just odd and random situations.
Well, what you're describing sounds suspiciously like the plot to Bid Time Return, which I'm saying that to prove my knowledge of science fiction. It was made into the movie with I was going to say George Reeves, but it was actually Christopher Reeve a number of years ago, Somewhere in Time, where
Somewhere in Time, yeah.
He sort of mentally projects himself back into the early 19th century, 20th century or late 18th century, and lives back in that time for a period of time before he comes forward. So he doesn't have a machine. It was kind of a matter of his willpower. But we're going to have to take a break here. When we come back, I'm talking to Nick Redfern. We're talking about his book, Time Travel, and science fiction aspects of it as well, which fascinates me more than some of these other things. I'll have more information and some pictures up on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. So please stick around. Nick Redfern is my guest. We're talking time travel. That's right, folks. I cannot speak the English language anymore. I'm going to switch to some other language here and fool everybody.
Yay.
We're talking about time travel. We were talking about the idea of people not inventing a machine and going back in time, and I think we've kind of explored that. What I wanted to do, Nick, is I know that in the book you explore the Philadelphia experiment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, again, this is a controversial one, but it's an intriguing one because, and that's why the book itself is, the subtitle has the word science fiction, because that case, the Philadelphia experiment, you can really sort of put it in sort of two camps, if you like, fiction or absolute 100% reality, or there could be somewhere in between, and there's no doubt that the Philadelphia experiment, for people who don't know, allegedly in 1943, the Philadelphia Naval Yard, a U.S. Navy military ship vanished briefly, and supposedly, some people have said it just went invisible. Some people said it time traveled, and so on. The story sort of really endured over the years to the point where novels have been written about it, movies, sequels, and so on and so on. And for me, it's a fascinating story because we know that something happened. Even the Navy has put out a fact sheet saying what they felt was the cause of these experiments. But then again, when you hear about sailors vanishing and things like this and never coming back, or then flickering for a while and then they're gone again, that would clearly have to be some kind of bizarre science that we just don't understand. But yeah, I think the Philadelphia experiment is probably the most visible example of potential time travel, and the fact that there's a degree of fact mixed with fiction, and a lot of people intercepted themselves into it. It's a fascinating story. I think we're kind of at this sort of brick wall situation right now. Some of the stories have gone way over the top. They're just crazy. But there was that time in sort of the 70s and 80s when I actually thought, later when I got the books and so on, that, this sounds feasible. And again, I think one important thing is with the Philadelphia experiment, if the stories are true, what the government did, and this is an important thing, was to shut it all down because they're not sure what was going on. And I think that possibly could be, an important issue when it comes to time travel, namely that perhaps the reasons why that a lot of achievements may not have been made is because of that fear of going too far. Kind of like, the final scenes in Raiders of the Lost Ark, instead of investigating the Ark of the Covenant, they put it all away and hide it. I think that's a possibility as well. Maybe there are people who have solved it, but it's such a bizarre kind of situation let's just not do anything with it. I think that's an intriguing picture, really.
But didn't all of this sort of originate with a fellow named Carl Allen, who called himself Carlos Allende?
Yeah, kind of like an over-the-top sort of wannabe Walter Mitty type character. Very strange guy. Yeah, he was someone who came forward in the 1950s and approached Morris Jessup, one of the 1950s UFO researchers, and Carlos Allende claimed that he knew the truth of the experiment of the Eldridge, USS Eldridge, supposedly going invisible or traveling through time or whatever. But Allende told the story to Morris Jessup. But what's particularly intriguing is that the U.S. Navy actually invited Jessup to come to the Navy, Naval Intelligence, and tell them exactly what Allende had told him. Now, if there was nothing to it, I don't think they would have flown Jessup out to the Navy and be, asking question after question, what do you know about this experiment? I think there's more to it, but whether the extra bit to it is time travel, although it's one of the key questions and one of the key claims, we're still looking into that, I think.
But did the Navy actually fly Jessup anywhere to discuss this with him, or did Jessup communicate with them first?
No, that's true. The Navy did fly Jessup out to the Navy, and they flew him in for dinner. They gave him a breakfast the next day, and then interviewed him. And the questions were, all about the supposed invisibility or time travel experiment, and Jessup was happy. It wasn't like a Men in Black type interrogation. It was actually quite, sort of relaxed. People might like, the idea of the Men in Black coming down and call that, it's exciting, but it wasn't like that. It actually was. Please just tell us what this guy said and what he told you, and so on. So, but the thing is, although Allende, claimed that he'd seen the ship vanish on another ship, that he was next to it and saw it vanish, despite all that, we're still in a situation where there are people who, granted they came after, but there are some credible people who did come forward after Allende came forward, admittedly. But Allende was not the only one. There's actually been quite a few people who over the years have come forward to talk about it. And some of them said when they were on the ship, one of them had to grab part of the ship because it looked like he wasn't standing on anything, freaked him out, that kind of thing.
Stay where you are, don't go away, Christopher.
But the thing that I find interesting about all of this, because I got involved into it in the 1970s, there were two naval officers who were interested in Jessup's book, I think it was this Case for the UFO, and the letters that Allende had sent discussing all of these things. One of them was he ended up as a captain, Sidney Sherby. I talked to the guy. He lived in, I think, Fort Worth, Varro Manufacturing. And
it's not far from me, actually.
yes, I know, because I lived in Texas at the time, and I went down and visited him. And he pointed out to me that the idea the Navy was very interested in this wasn't quite accurate, and that he and a fellow named Hoover, I believe it was, had become interested in it, and the Navy said they could look into it if they wanted to, as long as it involved Navy time and Navy resources. They produced the copy of the book, the annotated book that Allende had either sent to Jessup or to the Navy. I forget who it was actually sent to. So there were a number of copies made, and Sidney Sherby showed me his copy. He said that's one of the 5 that he had, and if I could copy it, Xerox it, then I could borrow it, which I did. So I've got a copy of the book that Varro Manufacturing made for them with all of this. But the point was the Navy wasn't interested in it. It was these 2 naval officers, and the fact that they were in the Navy kind of followed them along. And that kind of suggests that maybe it wasn't quite as important as it seemed at the time.
Well, that could be the case. I mean, it's so far down the line, 1943, and you've got like Chinese whispers, and she said this, and he said that, and my great uncle said that, there is that aspect to this, there's no doubt about that. However, it's like a lot of these stories, it does endure, and some of the people who've come forward have been genuine people. But yeah, I mean, if there was even just sort of like a portion of time travel to something like that, I could easily see why it would be shut down. Not because everything went wrong, maybe just because they did not know what to do, and I think that's a possibility. The idea that it was shut down not because it's going to open rifts and dinosaurs and, things from the past are going to come through. I don't think they were worried about that. I think they were worried because they were ignorant of what was going down. When I say ignorance, I don't mean in an insult kind of way. I mean it, from the perspective that they just did not know what to do. And so what people often do when they don't want to do something, they shove it away, and it wouldn't surprise me if something like that happened with the Philadelphia experiment, whether time travel or invisibility. I think there's a possibility that it was so dangerous potentially that they said let's just leave it, and maybe come back 5 years later, that kind of thing.
Well, I think the whole thing traces back to Carl Allen.
Yes, it does.
Either communicating with Jessup or the Navy or communicating with both Jessup and the Navy that got the whole thing started. But Allende showed up at APRO headquarters in the early 1970s, I think it was, maybe a little bit later, and told Jim Lorenzen that he'd made the whole thing up because Jessup's writings scared him, and confessed that it was all a hoax. And I think that was published in the APRO Bulletin at that time. And then Allende was on his way to Mexico because he thought he had cancer and he was dying and he wanted to confess the thing. And apparently the cancer went into remission, or he didn't have it. And he returned to Tucson, Arizona, where APRO was at the time, and collected the stuff he'd left with APRO and went about his merry way. But there was a confession that this thing was not true.
No, it may not have been. It may not have been. I mean, it's one of these things where we just don't have the answers. And, and I think the problem is, it's like a lot of cases when the government documentation particularly, has gone or it's buried or whatever, it's been getting more and more difficult to solve these cases. And but I think something happened with the Philadelphia experiment. If it was time travel, I could see what the hell do we do now,
Well, I think this brings us to a fellow named Al Balick, and we'll get to him in a moment. We'll come back to that. What I did want to say is that I've done some things about the Philadelphia experiment, the Allende letters, on my blog. I did an article in Official UFO a number of years ago, and Allende actually got a hold of it and made an annotated copy, annotated it the way they'd done the book, Jessup's book. And I'll link to some of that on my blog so that those of you who are interested in following up on this can take a look at some of that. But I think the important point is we've moved beyond Allende, who may have made the whole thing up and confessed it as a hoax, to others who have come forward and said, yes, I was part of that experiment and I have these tales to tell. And one of those guys was Al Balick, and we'll chat with him right after this when we come back. Once again, you are listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network, so please stick around. And I am here with Nick Redfern. We're talking about, I don't know, all kinds of things. Time travel especially. When we went away, I was going to say we were talking about Al Balick, who came forward long after this and talked about how he had been involved in the Philadelphia experiment. Tell us a little bit about Al Balick, please.
Well, yeah, I mean, the story itself of the Philadelphia experiment is really sort of split into two levels. You've got the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s era where, you know, people claim to have had knowledge of the events, or there are other ships and so on. And then you've got the other part of it, which is from the 80s, the 1980s onward. And it was in that period that we had people coming forward with some just bizarre, over-the-top scenarios and claims. And one of them was this guy named Al Balick. And Al Balick was someone who sort of commanded the whole scenario of the Philadelphia experiment in that era. You know, he was speaking at lectures, conferences, books were coming out. And yet everything was pretty much very different to, you know, like Bill Moore's book, for example, or the, you know, all the ones that came earlier. And basically, Balick was talking about jumping into different bodies and souls to explain how he looked younger than he should be, you know, in the 1980s, that kind of thing. And then that sort of rolled over into an even bigger and stranger scenario, that of the Montauk Project over at New York, supposedly deep underground. And all of this sort of rolled over into different things. You know, we've got the Philadelphia experiment, the original one, the Montauk experiments. You've got Balick talking about being sent through time, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And frankly, you know, I mean, I followed the Philadelphia experiment for a long time, but when I sort of really got into the Balick stuff, I mean, it's just garbage, you know.
I was going to say, I talked to Brad Steiger about it, and Brad Steiger was a good friend of his, Balick's, for a long time. And,
yeah, he wrote a book about it. Yeah.
And Brad said, and I believe he said it on this program the last time I spoke with him.
The problem I have, you know, I don't like to talk of, you know, people who are dead. Yeah, and Brad was actually a good friend to me. The one issue I had with Brad's book was the inclusion of Balick. There was still a lot of really fascinating material about the experiment without having to insert Balick and his wacky stories into it, you know.
Well, what I was going to say is Brad told me on the program that he was very disappointed in Balick when he found out that he wasn't telling the truth. Brad's attitude had always been, and I look at it from the point of view as an investigator, it's an attitude I just can't have, but I embraced the simplicity of it, which was he would believe what people told him until he discovered they weren't telling the truth. He wouldn't actively try to verify stuff. He would just go along with the stories being told. And he was very disappointed when he learned that Al Bielek wasn't among those most truthful people around. And was very disappointed in that. And I thought that was kind of the attitude that Brad always showed, that he would believe the tales. I first met him. I knew the secret for getting in touch with him at one point, which was he originally was name was Eugene Olson, and he taught in Decorah, Iowa. And I was looking at a case from disappearance case from Wales, and I looked at, I called up him to talk to about it, and he said to me, "Don't use this story, it's not true." And we built a friendship out of that sort of thing, our discussions about various aspects of various cases. So I was always impressed with Brad Steiger and what he did and how he handled his sort of investigations. And I wanted to make it clear, but he was very disappointed in what Al Bielek had said to him, or what Al Bielek had said, and ended up not believing the story. And I kind of destroys part of the Philadelphia experiment, I think, from that point of view.
What's that last bit? What did you say?
Well, it kind of destroys the Philadelphia experiment being something in the science.
Well, it does if you buy into the whole thing. Now, for me, I never bought into the Bielek stuff, and I've never bought into any of the Montauk stuff. I think something happened, but the crucial thing is that what we know and what we knew and what is the important material is what went down in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, and after that, it just got weird, you know.
Yes, it did. And I after talking to Sidney Sherby in Fort Worth, I pretty much was against the whole idea of the experiment, no matter what it was. I had heard that the original experiment was some kind of magnetism or degaussing experiment that would make the ship invisible to radar. Really not quite the same thing as making it invisible or teleporting it from one place to another.
Well, the Navy actually still stick to the degaussing one right now, because I wanted obviously to keep the book up to date, and so I asked the Navy if I could get their latest up-to-date fact sheet on the Philadelphia experiment, because they get asked all the time, and over the time, they've sort of put it together, modified it and whatever if there's new material. And they're actually quite open, and saying we thought it was this and then we thought it was that. But to this day, the Navy is still standing by the magnetic angle, the degaussers, and that's still in place, that scenario.
Well, I think that's something we have to take a look at, but I think we need to move on from that. We've kind of beat it into the ground. So I was wondering, is there some aspect of the book that really excited you that you think may be true?
What you mean in sort of time travel per se, so to speak? Yes. Yeah. Well, we've been sort of talking about the past, and again, I think there's this angle where, for whatever reason, that it seems to be, a lot of it does seem to be stuck into the past, so to speak. No pun intended. But it does. But what fascinates me are things, like the, excuse me, when we're talking about wormholes and things like that. And now, to what extent, that may have a bearing directly on time travel, but I think we're starting to see some really fringe science being developed. And when you're talking about black holes and so forth, and it makes me wonder if at one point, we won't just understand it, but we'll be able to control it. Now, if that does happen, potentially the day might come, that we could achieve time travel. But then, on the other hand, if we achieve it, well, and then we come back, haven't we already achieved it? So that's one of the things about, there's so many angles to time travel, and it fascinates me, but to a degree, it's sort of frustrating at times because of the sort of the red flags that pop up here and there, and yet at other times things sound really plausible.
Well, yeah, and we can always say we're always moving through time anyway. We're traveling through time. We're moving forward in time. And there's evidence that we can speed up the process. I think time dilation is one way that we would travel through time, but we certainly can't get back to or go back into the past and that sort of thing.
I think what it comes down to, people who are interested in time travel are probably hoping for the DeLorean scenario, as I call it. But I don't think that's what it is. And I think these random events that I talk about are more along the lines of the real situation, that there are strange and weird glitches in time that we just don't understand, but we know, well, something happened,
Yeah, I can think of scientific explanations for some of these glitches that would be, we might say is physically impossible, but they're based on gravity waves or some kind of physical phenomenon we don't understand that allows us to at least look into the future in some respects.
Yeah, and then of course, you've got the sort of the big nightmare, which all the other people who've sort of jumped in and sort of hoaxed things. I mean, a perfect example is Philip Corso, where basically he was saying that the Roswell UFO was some kind of time machine, and he never presented anything along those lines. It was just a simplistic sort of statement,
Well, I think that's something we need to explore at another time, because getting into that aspect of the Roswell case, we could go on and on about that forever and a week, I suppose. I want to thank you, Nick, for taking time out to chat with us today and give us your insights.
No, not a problem.
And
hopefully next time, all my audio and net connection will be okay next time. So.
Yeah, that would be nice too.
Yes, it would.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate your time today.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Once again, the book is Time Travel, the Science and Science Fiction by Nick Redfern, one of his many, many books. He's done lots and lots of them, but then again, so have I. I've got a book coming out in the near future on Project Moondust, an updated version of that. I've got a book coming out on Level Land, which we'll take a look at that. And I'm doing a book called Understanding Roswell, which tries to put it into a kind of perspective that makes it easier to understand after all the nonsense that has gone on. Like that. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Stan Gordon to talk about the Kecksburg UFO crash from his perspective on it, after we had Bob Young on it to talk about it in the past. You have been listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network, and I will return in about 167 hours. Thanks for tuning in.